Hey, good evening. I hope you're all doing well. Today we are going to be learning Maseches Menachos Daf Mem Vav. We're starting at the very bottom line of Daf Mem Hey Amud Beis, and we're going to stop at the very last word on Mem Vav Amud Beis, and then the next two blot are more normal in length. Today's Amud Beis is a longer blot and a little bit more of a difficult blot. Let's get started right at the bottom of the page. Amar Rabbi Yochanan Kol Modim. Everyone agrees in regards to the Shtei Halechem and the Shtei Kvasim. Everyone agrees that she'im huzkeku zelazeh, that if they have a zika between them, if they are connected in some way, shape, and form, she me'akvin zeh, then if one is missing, then the other is pasuled. The Gemara is saying these two are they're somewhat already bound to one another. But what happens if you're missing one? Would the other still function, or would it need both in order to function? So the Gemara says that if they are huzkaku, then they would be perfectly tied to one another in an inextricable way. Says the Gemara on the top of Memvav Med Aleph on the top line, what type of zika are we talking about? Be'ezahu zika shelahen. What is the zika? What is the bond that connects the shtei alechem and the shtei kvasim? That would be shchita. Now, I'm personally traumatized by the word Zika. I don't know if the rest of you are. We are not learning Yevamos. This just means a deep connection, which is actually what it means over there too. But I think just due to the nature of the complexity of Yevamos, we often have a negative. Maybe I'm just venting, but let's continue. So the Gemara says the link between the Shtei Alechem and the Shtei Kvasim, which is when Rabbi Yochanan would hold that everyone agrees that they're inextricably bound, is once Shechita takes place. Says the Gemara, Amar Ula, Ba'u b'ma'arava. Out in the west, they asked a question. What was the question? Tnufa ose zika. I know you said shchita does generate zika between the shtei alechem and the shtei kvasim, but what about tnufa? What about the moving around of certain parts of the korbanos? Tnufa ose zika, o ena ose zika. Yes or no? Is it just shchita or is it also tnufa? So the Gemara says, Pshot le mid Rabbi Yochanan. Perhaps we could learn an answer from the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan. To Amar Rabbi Yochanan, shchita ose zika. That's pretty clear. It's a very lean. You need every word. Shchita osazika. So what's implied from that? Well, michlal the tnufa ena osazika. So says the Gemara, guys, look, I just got the text that's in front of me. If Rav Yochanan is saying that shchita osazika, then shchita is osazika, not tnufa. So we have our answer. The Gemara says, you're correct in your diuk, but I'm actually asking a more basic question, says the Gemara. I'm trying to understand Rabbi Yochanan. Says the Gemara, the Rabbi Yochanan gufa kami baile. I'm not asking how to read the words of Rabbi Yochanan. I'm asking if perhaps Rabbi Yochanan should be understood differently. What does that mean? Mifshat pshita le the Rabbi Yochanan. Is it just obvious to Rabbi Yochanan to shchita osazika utznufa ena osazika? Is it clear that Rabbi Yochanan would hold that only shchita can generate a bond between the shtei alechem and the shtei kvasim, or not? Or odilma shchita pshita le utznufa mesafkale. Or perhaps the way that it's framed is, yes, I'm sure about shchita generating zika, but I'm unsure about tnufa. To this, the Gemara says, Teku, we're not 100% sure of the level of confidence in Rav Yochanan's shita as to whether or not zika is only true by shchita, or if zika could even be generated by tnufa. Says the Gemara, Omar le Rav Yehuda bar Chanina le Rav Huna bre Rav Yoshua. When the pasuk says Kodesh Yu Lashem La Kohen, when the pasuk says in Sefer Vayikra, let's read the whole pasuk about the Shnei Kvasim. V'hinifa Kohen osam al lechem habikurim. We're going to move the parts of the animal on the lechem habikurim, on the given breads. Tnufa lifnei Hashem al Shnei Kvasim Kodesh Yu Lashem La Kohen. It seems to be that we're going to be giving this to the Kohen. Now, when was this? Basar Tnufa Ksiv. This was after the Tnufa takes place. So if you look in the pasuk, Tnufa happens, and then it goes to the Kohanim. So that implies that it does go to the Kohen, and still in this case, after the Tnufa, Upligi ben Nanas v'Rabbi Akiva, you saw their shitas yesterday, and we'll see their shitas again in a couple of minutes. But we still see some degree of machlokas about that. So says the Gemara that therefore perhaps it's the case that tnufa is a valid form of zika. The Gemara responds a third of the way down. Ula ta'amech, according to what you're saying, basar tnufa v'lo basar shchita. Well, yes, it's after tnufa, but isn't tnufa after shchita? So we don't know which line of demarcation we're looking at. Are we looking at the tnufa that happened after the shchita? Or perhaps one could argue you're just looking at the shchita and it happens to be that also tnufa happened. So says the Gemara, it must be that mei karakoi. There actually are multiple tnufas. I was not aware of this, but there are multiple tnufas with this korban. And we're talking about the one that is before. And in short, a tnufa that is done before shchita makes this question more prominent, because perhaps the tnufa that was done before is therefore valid. If Rabbi Akiva and Ben Nanas argue there, that's a very good line of reasoning to assume that a tnufa is something that can generate zika. So the Gemara says, well, I hear what you're saying, but the pasuk doesn't read that way. Umay kodesh yula shem lakohen. It appears that the kohen gets it right away. After the tnufa, he gets it right away. So if he gets it right away, well, then the tnufa must generate zika. So the Gemara says, no, it could just be davar shesofa lakohen. It could be that after shchita he'll get it, but not now. So we don't know if this first tnufa is going to be valid. Hachanami, perhaps by the tnufa davar shesofa lakohen. But it could be that the shchita, could be that the kohen, that is the tnufa. We just don't know which one. And therefore, there's a little bit of a lack of clarity as to whether or not a tnufa can generate zika. So that was our question. We know for sure shchita generates zika. We're just not sure about the tnufa. And the Gemara halfway down now questions something that seemed basic to us. Ushchita osa zika. Is it in fact true that shchita, that the ritual slaughter does generate zika? That was the basic assumption of our Gemara on the second line of this page. That was all Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan said, shchita osa zika. The Gemara now questions that head on. The Gemara says, shchita osa zika. And I'm just going to be clear with you. We're going to learn a very lengthy technical brisa. We'll understand it on the surface level. Of course, each case, we're going to learn about 10 cases. Each case requires its Omer Dorsheni, but let's learn it on its face. The Gemara says, Urminhi, we have a brisa, which by its end will indicate that shchita is perhaps not something that generates zika. So let's say when it comes to the shtei alechem and the korban, it says, Ad shelo shachta, if before you do the shchita, nifras lachma, one of the lechamim gets ruined. So the halacha is, before the shchita, yavi lechem acher b'shochet. You ruined the lechem, no problem, things happen. Go get another one and do shchita. Misha shachta, once the shchita was done, and then nifras lachma, so things are going to be problematic, but the following is still true. You're right, hadam yizrak, you can still do zrikas hadam. So it's not going to be a puzzle korban. Basar ye'achel, the meat can be eaten. The Mefarshim point out that the meat in this case can be eaten like a shlamim. But videi nidro lo yatza v'halechem puzzle. Really, you can eat the meat, but the lechem that's broken is puzzle. You're not allowed to eat it. And you have no din of lechem here. You only did the korban itself. So that element is a little bit more complicated. That's if the bread got ruined after shchita. Let's say nizrak hadam. Let's say the dam was already nizrak and then the lechem broke. So then torei mimin hashalim arab ala paros. Then at that point you can give the kohanim the breads, but it has to be from the good bread, the unbroken bread, and not from the broken bread. Let's say before the shchita was done, the lechem was taken out of the azara, out of the appropriate area. Let's say that was true. So says the Gemara, machnisa v'shochet. You bring the bread back into the azara, and then you just continue. It doesn't get completely puzzled by having brought it outside of the azara. Instead, what one should do is bring the lechem back inside. Misha shachta yatzalachma. Let's say after the shchita, then someone takes out the lechem. So hadam yizrak ve'abasar yochal v'denidra lo yatza lechem pasal. This is not good. After shchita is bad. Now here we're talking about lechem being brought on the chutz. In the first case, we were talking about the lechem falling apart. We'll get back to that first case in a moment. Nizrak hadam. Let's say that the dam had been nizrak, tore and the lechem had then gotten ruined. Tore mimashe bifnim al shebachutz. You give kohanim the bread that's good from the inside, the bread that was not taken outside. Nizrak hadam, we did that. Ad shalosh shachta, nitma lachma. So we spoke about the bread falling apart. We spoke about the bread being taken out of the azara. Now we're going to talk about tuma. Says the Gemara, Nizrak, I'm sorry, Ad shalosh shachta nitma lachma. If before the shchita the bread becomes tamei, maybe lechem acher b'shochet. We have a replacement bread, no problem at all. Misha shachta nitma lachma hadam yizrak v'abasar achav v'yed nidro yatsa. This is different than the previous two cases. Why by the tuma do we allow for this korban to still be valid? Hare the shchita was done and then the lechem was ruined. The answer is shehatzitz meratze ala tamei ve'alechem pasal. We know that the neder will be fulfilled because we have a halacha that the tzitz is meratze, and therefore the korban is going to be good, but the lechem is still going to be possible. What if nizrak hadam? What if the blood was sprinkled and then the bread got ruined? Torah mina tahor ala tamei. End of the brisa. Now we don't yet know the question, so the Gemara is now going to provide us with the punchline. But let's just go back to the beginning of our question. At the front of our page today, at the top of our page, we learned from Rav Yochanan that shchita osa zika, that a shchita can generate an inextricable bond between the shtei akvasim and the shtei alecha. The Gemara in the middle of the page questioned that with this brisa. Now, what do we extract from the brisa that is the question itself? Says the Gemara 5 lines from the bottom of the page. Make that 6 lines. V'isal kadaitach shchita osa zika. If it's true that shchita generates zika, well, kevan dehuskiku zelazeh, since in the early part of the brisa, there were two things that needed each other, which was the lechem and the toda. If saleh lechem, tifsal nami toda. Something in the beginning shouldn't have been the case. What should have been is that if the bread was ruined, the toda was also ruined. But that's not what the brisa said. If you look back in one of the first cases of the brisa, actually the second of that first set of cases, it says that mishashach the nifras lachma, we said that the korban toda was good, but the bread was bad. But if you want to say that shchita is a zika, then they should have the same halacha. We shouldn't have separated the bread and said it's puzzle, but the toda is good. If there's zika, they should have the same exact halacha. So Kasha and Rav Yochanan. How could Rav Yochanan say that shchita generates zika? We see in this brisa, clear as day, that there's not the same halacha between the lechem and between the toda, afal pi, that there was shchita. So shchita must not be a zika. Says the Gemara, shiny toda. A toda is different. Why? Because the rachmana karya shlamim. Even though you're right, maybe fundamentally we do hold that shchita is a zika, but there's an exception to that rule when it comes to a toda, because the toda is referred to as a shlamim in Chumash. So if you look at the pasuk in Vayikra Zayin Yud Gimel, the pasuk says, Al chalos lechem chametz yakriv korbano al zevach todas shilamav. Oh, so this totally changes things. Now we see that a korban toda has a din of a shlamim. And the Gemara articulates what that actually means. When the Torah creates this equation between a shlamim and a toda, what do we learn? Ma shlamim krevim below lechem, av toda kreva below lechem. Really shchita is a zika. But there's an overarching and overriding principle that a toda is also a shlamim. And even though really it should be the case that if misha shachta, like the brisa says, then we find out that the lechem was ruined, really we should say that not only is the lechem ruined, but so is the toda. But we have to employ, there's like a little bit of an asterisk. The toda is different because the toda is like a shlamim, and a shlamim is kosher without bread. So too, the toda is kosher without bread, like in the brisa. So we tried to ask on the principle of shchita being a zika. We tried to undermine it, kamash malan, that there is no problem. Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah on the last line of Mem Vav Amid Aleph now. Im tim salomar tnufa osa zika. Let's go back to our question that we asked on the top third of this page. If you want to say that tnufa, that moving around the animal parts is osa zika, so then what should be true? It should be that avad halechem, that if you lost the bread, then avdu kvasim. Then it would be the case that if you lost, and Rashi points out a little logistical detail, if avad halechem achar tnufa, if the tnufa generates zika, so then, says the Gemara, then if you lose the bread, then you also are not able to be makriv the korban anymore. You can't eat the korban, I should say. That's not allowed. And the reverse is also true, that if in fact Tnufa is a Zika, that if Avdu Kvasim, then Avad Halechem. And Ve'im Tim Salomar Tnufa Eina Osa Zika, and if what you want to say is that the Tnufa, the act of moving around the parts of the animal, does not generate Zika, if that's true, well, then we have to look at it in the following split way. Hevi lechem ukvasim. If one were to have brought the breads and the animals, vihunfu, and then they did tnufa, and then v'avad lechem v'hevi lechem acher, you lost the bread and replaced it. Well, also halechem ton tnufa, o ein ton tnufa. Would we need to generate a new tnufa for this new bread because it hasn't been done to this bread yet? Do we say that that would be true or not? Avdu kvasim, if we were talking about losing the animals and then you replaced it, loti boilach, the vadai boy tnufa. Everyone agrees that you would need a new tnufa by the animal. Kiti boilach avad lechem. We would only have a question if you would have lost the lechem, because pashat the meat, that's a pasuk in Chumash that the animal parts have to have tnufa. Now, within this concept of losing the bread, this question of whether or not we'd have to do a new tnufa, here too we have a split. Ve'aliba de ben nanas, according to ben nanas, lo tibaylach, the amar kvasim ikar, that the kvasim are the ikar, and therefore we don't need to do a new tnufa if we replace the lechem. And kiti baylach aliba de Rabbi Akiva. The only time we would have a question of when we replaced the lechem as to whether or not it would require a tnufa, that's only within the shita of Rabbi Akiva, who holds the amar lechem ikar. My, what would be the case according to Rabbi Akiva? Do we say kevan de lechem ikar by tnufa? Do we say that because Rabbi Akiva holds that the lechem is the ikar as opposed to the kvasim, and therefore because we are replacing the lechem, therefore by tnufa, odilma kevan de matirin dide kvasim ninhu, since the matir of the lechem anyways is the kvasim, lo tzarach tnufa. So says the Gemara, take it, we don't know. We don't know, but all of this is within the camp of Rabbi Akiva. Okay, so we've learned a little bit today about the Zika between the Shtei Kvasim and the Shtei Alechem, and now we're going to try and compare that to another area of halacha. We're about 10 lines down on Mem Vavim and Beis, heading to the very last word on the page. Says the Gemara, Amar le Abaye le Rava. When it comes to the shtei kvasim and the shtei alechem, there's an ikuv between them. We have the azika between them. Shiva kvasim upar ve'elim. What about a different type of korban with the shiva kvasim par ve'elim? The lo mekache lechem v'lo ma'akve. There is no zika between them. Why is it that the halachos are different? So says the Gemara, Amar le. Because when it comes to the shnei kvasim and the lechem, they both have a din of tnufa. But that's not true, says the Gemara, by the shiva kvasim and the par be'elim. Says the Gemara, wait 1 second. But when it comes to a toda, we only have a din of tnufa by one and not the other, yet we see they're inextricably bound. Ella, says the Gemara, ketoda. Really, our question should be talking about a toda. Matoda shlamim, avachanami shlamim. That perhaps in our case, we would have said that our case of shnei kvasim is like a case of shlamim. Says the Gemara, midami. How can you say this? Hasam, by a korban toda, lekazvacham acharini bahadeh. There's only the korban and the toda. There are no extraneous korbans. But hacha, when we talk about the shtei alechem, the ikazvachem achrina behadeh, there really are other korbanos, likdushuhani vahani. They should definitely be connected by the zika. So says the Gemara, you're right. We shouldn't compare it to a toda, but rather ella ke'el nazir. The shtei alechem are actually compared to the ram of a nazir. Ma'el nazir, just like the ram of a nazir, that afal gav the ikazvachem achrini, even though there are, as we know by a nazir, there are many korbanos, shlamim hu dimikadshe, the shlamim is going to be bound to that korban, but midi achrina lo, Hachanami loshna. Maybe the same thing would be true by the shtei alechem, that only there do we have a din of zika, but not by the case of the shiva kvasim upar ve'elim. Says the Gemara of Hasamin. And how do we know that to be true by Nazir? That by Nazir we have a din of shlamim and it doesn't apply to, there's no only zika between the El Nazir and the shlamim. How do we know that? The Tanya, last of the short lines and first of the long lines. We have a brisa. Actually, if you look on the side over here, you will see that that is corrected to dichsiv. It's actually not a brisa, that's a change. The Gemara says as follows. The Gemara quotes a pasuk ve'es ha'ayil ya'aseh zevach shilamim la'Hashem al sal matzos. Milamed, in regards to the to this particular case, to this pasuk in Bamidbar, she'asal bachova la'ayil u'shchitas el mekadshon, that there is a basket that is brought here about the ayil, and the shchitas ayil is mekadesh, that the shchita of that ayil is mekadesh the lechem. Lefichach, therefore, shachto shelo lishma lo kichu lechem. There is some form of zika, as we can see, between the bread and the korban. Tanu Rabbanan, the Brisa writes as follows. This Brisa is going to be found later on in the Masech in another 30 blot or so. Shtei halechem habos bifnei atzman. Let's say that we had the shtei halechem, but we didn't have any kvasim, so no zika. We have these the breads are being brought on their own. So the halacha is yunfu. We should do tenufa. And then the te'ubar tzurasan. Te'ubar tzurasan is something that we've learned before, where we kind of wait until the tzura of this particular thing changes. V'yatzu lebeis hasreifa. And then we take out the lechem and we burn them. So says the Gemara, I'm very confused by this halacha. Let's get our case straight. We have the shtei halechem without the kvasim. So we say you do tenufa, you wait until te'ubar tzurasan, and then you burn it. So says the Gemara, I don't understand manav shach. 4 lines into the wide lines, halfway down. If they're edible, then eat them. If the shtei halechem are edible, then eat them. If they are to be burned, then lisserfinu la'altar, then burn them right away. But why are you taking the shtei halechem and going through this waiting process of te'ubar tzurasan? Lama lehu ibor tzura. Why would you do that? So the Gemara responds, Amar Rabba, let's see if we can try and break down this cryptic brisa. Again, let's get our case clear. We have shtei halechem that's being brought, but there is no shtei hakvasim to join them. So we do tenufa to ubar tzurasan, and then they get burnt. The Gemara wants to know, if you can eat them, then eat them. If you're burning them, burning them. Why are we waiting? What's the waiting game? So the Gemara says as follows, Amar Rabba le'achilak asyan. Really, Mida oraisa, they're really fully edible, the shtei halechem without the kvasim. But the reason why we don't eat them, says Rabbah, is because gzeira shema yizdamnu lakvasim l'shana haba. Maybe in a future year we'll have enough money and there will be kvasim. V'yomru, and people will erroneously say, look at last year, ishtakad, last year lo achalnu lechem below kvasim. Didn't we eat the shtei halechem even though there were no kvasim? Achshav nami nechol. This year we're going to do the same thing. But that's a mistake. That's not correct. Because when there are kvasim, says the Gemara, Ve'inhu lo yade, those people who made that mistake, they saw one year you ate the shtei halechem when there were no kvasim. But that's really not the din. Ve'inhu lo yade de ishtakad lo havu kvasim. Last year when you only had shtei halechem, yeah, maybe midoraisa you're allowed to eat it. But you'll make a mistake the next year when there are kvasim. Inhu sharion nafshaihu. Ve'inhu lo yadid ishtakad lo habu kvasim. And inhu sharion nafshaihu. What is the matir for the bread but the kvasim? So you're right. Mido raisa, you're allowed to eat the shtei halechem even though there's no kvasim. That's true. But Chachamim didn't allow it. We were concerned that in a future year where there were kvasim, where really the kvasim are the matir, Chas v'sholom, someone might have made an error and eaten the lechem in the next year, and they didn't wait for the kvasim, and that would be aser. So that's the gzera derabanan. Hashta the ika kvasim hu desharlu. Really, the din should be that when you have kvasim, then you're allowed to eat the bread. That's why we are makbid that when there's only shtei halechem, we do not eat it even though midoraisa you're allowed. Says the Gemara, Amar Rabba who just told us that really mida oraisa, the shtei lechem without the kvasim are edible. Mina aminola. How do I know that mida oraisa, the shtei lechem, can be eaten in a year when there are no kvasim? Says the Gemara Ditnan. This is a Mishnah that we saw many moons ago in Maseches Shkalim. You might remember this person's name. Amr YehudaHeid Ben Bukhri or Ben Kuvri, a different version of the Gemara. I remember Ben Bukhri. I don't remember Ben Kuvri. I'm surprised I remember any of it. And I don't remember what he said. I just remember the name. And he said, B'yavne, remember that Shkalim is all about the mitzvah of Machzis HaShekel. So did the Kohen give or did the Kohen not give? Says the Gemara. What did Rabbi Yehuda in the name of Ben Bukhri say? Kol Kohen sheshokel eino chote. If a Kohen were to give of the Machzis HaShekel, he is not doing an Avera. Doesn't sound lechatchila for him to give. That's not a nice phraseology. Amar lo Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, low key, that's not correct. Ela kol Kohen she'eino shokel chote. He says you're obligated to give. Any Kohen who does not give, that's going to be problematic. He has to give. He's going to be a chote. Ella, what was really going on over here is that yes, the Kohanim were obligated, affirmative, in Machzis HaShekel. Ella Shakohanim Darshan Mikra Ella Atzman. The Kohanim learned something incorrectly. They said, "V'chol minchas kohen kalil tiyeh lo seyachel," that the mincha of a kohen has to be completely burnt up to Hashem and it should not be eaten. And hoel ve'omer, hoel, since the omer, which is bread, ushtei halechem, which is bread, ulechem aponim, which is bread, shalanu hein, heich ne'cholim. How are we allowed to eat it? We shouldn't be allowed to eat it. So how is that funded by the Machzis HaShekel? So we must be that we're not allowed to play a role because we're not allowed to eat it. So says the Gemara, Hani shtei halechem hechidami. Tell me the scenario of the shtei halechem that we are discussing. Ilema bevos im hazevach. If you want to tell me that the shtei halechem are being brought with a korban, so says the Gemara, Atu toda v'lachma milo menad ve'kohan ve'achlelehu. That can't be it. It can't be that that's usher because if you're saying that they normally get it, but we can always get it because they can always do an adava and get it. So that can't be the case. El alav, says the Gemara, bevos bifnei atzman. We must be talking about where the lechem aponim are being brought on their own. V'katani heach hein ne'echalin. What do we see when the shtei lechem are being brought on their own? They should be eaten. That's how we see that without kvasim, that it's still edible. Alma le'achila asyan. So this is Rabba's raya to his opinion. We were trying to figure out how could it be that we have an explanation of this Mishnah. It says the shtei alechem, you're not allowed to eat it, to bar tu rasan, and then you burn it. Asks the Gemara, what's with the games? Either eat it or burn it. What's with the tu bar tu rasan? Rabba says, midoraisa, it's allowed, as we just saw from this brisa. But midrabanan, we're concerned about a year where there are no kvasim. For when a year there is kvasim, and people will forget that the kvasim is the matir for the lechem. Amar le Abaye to Rabba. He says it's a little bit difficult. Rabba was older. Rabba was a 3rd century Amor. Maybe it's Rava. Is there a correction there? I think there might be. No, Amar Rabba. Yeah. Yeah, I don't. Maybe he was talking. I don't know who he's talking to. I know it's difficult. Amar le Rabba le'olam, really no. Bevosim zevach. The case wasn't shtei alechem without kvasim. Really, it was brought with a korban. Yudikokashalach mitoda velachma lach metoda lo ikru mincha shtei alechem ikru mincha. The lach metoda don't have a din of a korban mincha, but the shtei alechem actually do. Shneimar b'hakrivchem mincha chadash al Hashem. And with this, Abaye kind of pokes a hole in the opinion of Rabbah that we were dealing with a case of shtei alechem without kvasim. Abaye would argue that we're talking about a case of shtei alechem with the kvasim. So you can't bring a raya for Rabbah's shita from this brisa. Rav Yosef Amar the exact opposite. Now Rav and Rav Yosef lived in the same door. So Rabba wrote, what does Rav Yosef say? Unlike Rabba, he says, Amar le'olam l'sreifa asyan. Really, if you have shtei alechem without kvasim, really what you need to do is burn it. Hainu taima de lo sarfinan. Why don't we burn it right away? Because, says the Gemara, Lefisha ein sarfin kadshim b'yom tov. That's for a technical reason. Because you have to wait because it's Yontif and you're not allowed to do this. So when the Shtei Lechem are brought on Yontif. So if you only have Shtei Lechem with no kvasim, you ran out of money in the base of Mikdash, God forbid. So then the halacha is that ein sarfin kadshim b'yom tov. So this is answer number 2 that Rav Yosef says. Amar le Abaye, also again, Abaye was a Talmud of Rav Yosef. So I don't know, I didn't look this up. It does bother me though. Amar le Abaye, midami. How are you able to compare these two things of ein sarf and kachim? Hasam, over there, says the Gemara, where there's no kvasim, lav mitzvasan bekach. Over there, you're doing the mitzvah wrong. You're doing shtei alechem, but you're doing it without kvasim. But hacha, where there are shtei alechem with kvasim, the mitzvasim bekach lisrafinu, it should be burned right away. Midi dahavi efer v'sar shel kippurim, like anything else on Yom Kippur. So the cases are not really comparable. Elo Amar Rav Yosef, he touches a little bit. Gzeira shema yizdamnu lahem kvasim la'achar mikan. This was kind of like the answer that we saw later, is that we saw earlier, which is that once you have the possibility of finding kvasim later, we need to wait and see if that will happen. Because if the kvasim do show up, then there'll be a matir. Otherwise, you're not allowed to eat the lechem. So we were concerned that if you only had shtei lechem without kvasim, that perhaps someone's going to show up and say, no, I am donating kvasim. So because of that, he says we're concerned. Amar le Abaye, Tenach kol zman hakravasam. I could understand for as long as it's viable to bring the korban. But lebasar hachi, after the zman for the korban, lisrafinu, you should burn it. Mai tu ubar tzurasa nami diktani. Why are you using this weird thing about waiting? So says the Gemara, the tu'ubar tzurasan that we're discussing is not regular tu'ubar tzurasan. Normally when we talk about tu'ubar tzurasan, what we're talking about is waiting for an animal that died to look dead. Right when an animal dies, it looks like it's sleeping. At some point, rigidity kicks in, rigor mortis, the eyes look different, there's blood pooling, the animal looks different. That's tu'ubar tzurasan. We're kind of borrowing a phrase here. Tu'ubar tzurasan here just means tzuras hakravasam, the order of regular korbanos. It does not mean what we thought it meant, and therefore, that is not a strong question. Rava Amar, this is answer number 3, really, and he's similar to Rabba, which was answer number 1, really le'achila asyan ugzeira mishum de Rabba. Really, he agrees with Rabba, and he agrees with the gzeira of Rabba, that we're afraid in a future year that it would be problematic, because if one year you have shtei alechem with no kvasim and we let you eat it, then in the next year where there's shtei alechem with kvasim, you might eat the shtei alechem before the matir of the kvasim. Rava agrees to Rabba on everything he said except for one thing, the source. Whereas Rabba brought a brisa, Rava is bringing a pasuk. Says the Gemara, "V'lav mitame ela mikra." He brings a pasuk. What's the pasuk that teaches us, from Rava's perspective, that the shtei alechem by itself would be edible, even though we wouldn't do it lemaisa because of the gzeira of Rabba? Says the Gemara, "Dichsiv mimoshvosechem taviu lechem tenufa bikurim laHashem. Ma bikurim bifnei atzman, af shtei alechem bifnei atzman." Oh, there you go. So Rava has a drasha from a pasuk. Umino, what do we learn from here? Ma bikurim leachila, af shtei alechem nami leachila. So midoraisa, we would allow for the shtei alechem without kvasim to be consumed based on a pasuk. So we had 3 answers to our question. We had Rabbah saying that really shtei alechem on their own could be eaten, but we're concerned midrabanan that in a year where there are kvasim that you'd make a mistake. We have Rava saying really it should be burned, but ein sarfin b'yom tov. And then we had that was not answer number 2. We had Rav Yosef who said that really it should be burned. And then we had Rava agreeing to Rabba, just from a different source, that midoraisa, one is allowed to eat it. We're just concerned about a year where the shtei alechem with no kvasim would be followed by the shtei alechem with kvasim. Mirza Hashem will pick up on Shabbos with Daf Mem Zayin right at the top of the page. Wishing you all a beautiful night.